All right, move along now. Inside the tent.
It's okay. You can use this to clean yourself now.
August 1945. A humid morning settles over a makeshift Allied processing center on the Philippine island of Luzon. The war is ending, but no one is ready to believe it yet. Japanese soldiers, exhausted, wounded, and hollow-eyed, are escorted into captivity. Among them are women in immaculately kept uniforms, rank pins still gleaming despite the dirt and smoke of battle. They were trained to never surrender, to die rather than face the shame of capture. Their steps are hesitant, shoulders tight, eyes lowered. They expect humiliation, punishment, violence. Posters in Japan had warned them. Americans would torture them, desecrate them, strip their honor and their dignity. Every instinct tells them to resist, to brace for the worst. Then, something unexpected happens. Allied nurses hand them soap, white clean bars, fresh towels, buckets of clean water, a chance to wash away weeks of fear and sweat and jungle rot. The women stare, confused. Their fingers tremble as they accept the simple items. For the first time since capture, they breathe, because nothing in their training prepared them for kindness. This fragile moment, born from shock and humanity, would redefine everything that followed. For decades before the Pacific War erupted, Imperial Japan had crafted a society built upon obedience, sacrifice, and the unbreakable will of the emperor's subjects. Men were expected to fight. Women were expected to support them without hesitation. Yet as Japan expanded across East Asia and the Pacific in the late 1930s and early 1940s, women took on more direct roles in the machinery of war. Tens of thousands served as nurses, clerks, radio operators, translators, and auxiliaries within the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy. Many were graduates of strict women's academies, trained in discipline and loyalty. Their uniforms carried rank. Their oaths carried weight. They were considered officers not by combat tradition, but by duty to the state. Still, the rules that governed them were absolute. Surrender was never an option. The Bushido Code, adapted and reshaped for modern propaganda, insisted that honor was found only in death. It was better to fall beneath a grenade than to let an enemy see one's fear. This belief was drilled into men and women alike, reinforced through stories of heroic self-sacrifice and warnings of foreign brutality. Posters and state broadcasts painted the United States and its allies as demons, barbaric forces that would mutilate and violate any who fell into their hands. Mothers told daughters that capture meant a fate worse than death. In training camps, instructors emphasized that Allied soldiers would show no mercy, especially to women. So these women entered war with a certainty. If captured, they would die. If not by the hands of the enemy, then by their own. The small pistols they carried or the cyanide capsules issued to certain units symbolized that duty. Throughout the Pacific, battles intensified. From Guadalcanal to New Guinea, from Saipan to Leyte, Japan's empire began to collapse in 1944. As U.S. Marines and soldiers pressed closer to the Japanese homeland, a new reality emerged. Civilians and non-combatant personnel, including women officers, were increasingly caught in the chaos of failing defenses. Some were stationed in hospitals near the front, offering what care they could to soldiers fighting a losing struggle. Others handled communications, typing frantic reports of advancing enemy forces. Many believed reinforcements would arrive. Relief would come. Japan could still turn the tide. But the Allied advance was relentless. On Saipan, in June 1944, mass suicides of Japanese civilians and military staff shocked the Americans. Women leapt from cliffs with children in their arms. Nurses threw themselves into the sea. Anything was considered better than falling alive into enemy grasp. For those who survived and were taken prisoner, shock overwhelmed them. They were certain interrogation would be their final act. Yet U.S. personnel treating these early female captives, following Geneva Convention principles, issued bandages, food, and medical assistance. The women did not understand. They avoided eye contact. Some refused to eat, convinced the food was poisoned. The suspicion ran deep, shaped by years of indoctrination. The imperial message remained unchanged. Japan fights to the last. Tokyo radio insisted that Allied atrocities were happening everywhere, urging women to choose death if surrounded. Even cultural expectations reinforced the fear. A woman's purity was considered part of national honor itself. The idea of an American soldier even touching them, not violently, but for something like medical care, was perceived as shameful, even apocalyptic. By 1945, the war had pushed into the Philippines and Okinawa. Japanese resistance grew desperate. Women worked in underground hospitals, in bunkers choking with smoke as bombardment shattered everything above. They heard the cries of dying soldiers, listened to the thunder of artillery, and waited for the moment when American boots would reach their doors. And yet, despite the dread and defiance that shaped them, not all would choose suicide. Some were captured alive, injured, weak, or simply unable to continue. These women walked into Allied custody expecting nightmares. What they found instead was the first crack in years of fear. The shock of survival and compassion would transform their beliefs in ways they never imagined. That transformation begins with the deeper collapse of Japan's Pacific defenses. As Japan's defensive lines shattered across the Pacific in 1945, surrender was no longer an unimaginable concept. It was becoming an unavoidable reality. Manila had fallen. Iwo Jima was lost. Okinawa, the last fortress before the Japanese homeland, became a catastrophic struggle for survival. Thousands of Japanese personnel, including women nurses and clerical officers, were trapped with dwindling supplies and no escape. In caves and reinforced tunnels, young women in military uniforms watched as wounded men filled every available cot. They dressed wounds in darkness. They rationed morphine. They whispered reassurances they did not believe. The distant thunder of naval artillery shook dust from ceilings. Every hour, another corridor collapsed. When American forces finally breached these strongholds, chaos erupted. Some women attempted to destroy documents. Others clutched grenades to their chests, trembling but determined. A few tried to hide among the wounded, consumed by terror. Yet many were captured alive, not through surrender, but through the simple fact that death had not reached them first. Here, the contrast between expectation and reality became stark. Upon capture, Allied troops separated the wounded from healthy. Medics, often under the supervision of U.S. Army nurses or Red Cross personnel, administered first aid. They bandaged burns, treated infections, offered clean water. The Japanese women recoiled. Some flinched at every movement, convinced pain was coming. What arrived instead were supplies they had been denied for months. Soap bars, clean towels, disinfectants, fresh clothing. These simple objects held symbolic weight. Throughout the war, Japanese propaganda insisted the Allies viewed them as less than human, worthy of only contempt and violence. Yet here were their supposed tormentors insisting on hygiene, comfort, and medical dignity. Some of the women stared in disbelief, unable to process what it meant. On Okinawa, Allied nurses recalled Japanese captives bowing repeatedly, in tears, apologizing for accepting such graciousness. Many could not speak English, but gratitude transcended words. Others kept their distance, eyes wide with confusion, unsure whether kindness was a trick. The shock did not stem solely from cultural misinformation. Japan itself had struggled to maintain even basic supplies. In frontline hospitals, water was scarce, soap nearly mythical. Filth became a daily enemy as diseases spread. To be handed personal hygiene items in captivity felt like an impossibility. The Allied forces did not treat these women as equals in command, but they did treat them as human beings entitled to care. This environment created its own tension. Behind the scenes, Allied intelligence personnel viewed female prisoners as valuable sources of information. Women often handled communications, logistics, and administrative plans, material that could reveal defensive structures or supply shortages. But interrogation methods depended heavily on establishing trust. For many Japanese women officers, that trust required dismantling years of indoctrination. Every towel given, every wound cleaned, chipped away at the image of Allied cruelty. Meanwhile, Japan continued urging resistance. Radio broadcasts demanded loyalty unto death. Surrender remained taboo, and those taken prisoner were considered traitors by default. Women who survived captivity might return home, but their reputations would not return with them. Honor lost in war was not easily restored, and so a psychological conflict emerged. If the enemy was not the monster they had been taught to fear, then what did their suffering mean? What did their sacrifices accomplish? And what did it say about the leaders who had sworn the Allies would treat them like animals? While this internal reckoning unfolded in POW camps across the Pacific, the broader war moved swiftly toward its final climax, the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, followed by Japan's surrender in August 1945. By the end of the conflict, thousands of Japanese women found themselves under Allied custody for the first time in history. Their experience became a profound historical contradiction. Captured by enemies, yet treated more gently than their own propaganda had ever allowed them to imagine. This transformation can only be understood fully by examining the many angles that define their captivity: mental, emotional, cultural, and strategic. Those angles reveal how a bar of soap became a powerful symbol of humanity, and a turning point in their understanding of the world beyond Japan. From their earliest training, Japanese women serving the military were told that surrender erased everything they represented. In a society where duty to the emperor outweighed personal survival, choosing captivity was considered a disgraceful betrayal. Their uniforms carried not only rank, but symbolic purity, the idea that a woman's honor embodied Japan's honor. Losing that purity, even metaphorically, meant shame that could outlast the war. Propaganda reinforced that fear relentlessly. Films, school lessons, and news broadcasts described Allied forces as vicious, immoral predators. Women were warned that capture meant torture, exploitation, or sexual enslavement. Many carried grenades or small pistols not to fight, but to take their own lives should the enemy approach. So when Allied soldiers reached them, these women were already emotionally broken. Their expectations were not just of defeat, but of annihilation. The moment a bar of soap touched their palms, the narrative they believed in crumbled. Their fear had been absolute, the reality profoundly different. That internal collapse, the dismantling of a lifetime of belief, was often more disorienting than battle itself. And yet, despite the shock, the first seeds of survival instinct began to take root, challenging decades of conditioning. For Japanese women officers, daily life in captivity betrayed every expectation they carried into the war. Instead of brutality, they encountered routine: washrooms organized with basins, water tanks, soap supplies, towels, and clean uniforms allotted methodically according to need. Food arrived at regular intervals. Basic but nourishing meals: rice, vegetables, canned meats. Women gaunt from starvation felt strength return. Medical staff disinfected wounds that had festered for weeks. Diseases that had seemed like death sentences were suddenly reversed by penicillin or sulfa drugs. The shock was not only physical, it was philosophical. If the enemy cared for their health, what did that say about everything they'd been taught? The atmosphere of the camps varied by location and circumstance. Some offered more comfort than others, but the general principle remained. Humane treatment was policy, not charity. The Geneva Convention outlined these rights, and Allied command worked to uphold them, even when resentment brewed beneath the surface. For many women who had expected violence, the simple act of being handed a towel felt like both relief and humiliation. Relief that they would live. Humiliation that their survival required compassion from those they had been told were less than human. Every new day in captivity deepened this complex emotional conflict. One of the most significant factors shaping Japanese women's experience in captivity was the presence of Allied women in uniform. American and Australian nurses, many veterans of frontline medical work, approached their duties with professionalism shaped by their own trials. These were women who had treated burn victims from Pearl Harbor, malaria patients from New Guinea, and shrapnel-laden Marines from Okinawa. They knew loss. They knew pain. They understood fear. So when Japanese women, technically enemy combatants, were handed into their care, these nurses did not react with hatred. They offered empathy. They provided sanitary pads, soap, brushes, and clean garments. They helped wash hair matted with weeks of dust and sweat. Some attempted small, comforting smiles, gestures limited by language, but powerful nonetheless. For the Japanese officers, the encounter shattered another barrier. They had been warned of savage Western women corrupted by immoral culture. Instead, they saw competence, quiet discipline, and a shared burden of war. These moments did not make them allies. Not yet. But they planted the first fragile recognition that womanhood did not disappear behind enemy lines. The tension between old beliefs and new experiences would deepen as captivity continued, and intelligence officers stepped forward to ask questions. For many Japanese women officers, the greatest shock of captivity was not the loss of freedom. It was the unexpected presence of humanity. They had been indoctrinated to believe Americans would treat them as animals or trophies. The idea that an enemy would respect cleanliness, privacy, or dignity contradicted every wartime narrative they had known. When handed a towel, their reaction often revealed the emotional weight of indoctrination. Some bowed repeatedly, shaking. Others watched with suspicion, waiting for the cruelty they believed would follow. A few initially refused to bathe, convinced humiliation lay hidden behind generosity. But day after day, the mistreatment never arrived. A basin of clean water became a revelation. A folded towel felt like a contradiction. The absence of degradation forced them to confront a painful possibility. They had been deceived. The propaganda that shaped their fear was a weapon just as real as any rifle or bayonet. And now, faced with compassion from barbarians, the foundation of loyalty that governed every decision began to crack. The longer they lived in this new reality, the more a single question echoed quietly inside them. If the enemy can show mercy, what was the war truly for? For Allied military intelligence, Japanese women captives represented far more than humanitarian responsibility. Many of these officers had worked in communications coded, transmissions, logistics coordination, supply tracking, and cryptography. Their knowledge held potential advantages. Interrogators approached them not with threats, but with patience. A clean uniform and a meal softened resistance more effectively than violence ever could. Trust offered breakthroughs that fear never would. Some women, still clinging to pride, refused to answer. But others, confronted with the reality that Japan's defeat was imminent, opened up carefully. They provided insights on bunker networks, medical shortages, troop morale. Even small pieces of information could save Allied lives. As cooperation increased, they were sometimes treated with privileges meant to reward compliance. Extra rations, more comfortable bedding, personal hygiene supplies. The women who chose silence faced no brutality. But internally, they battled a more painful struggle. If the emperors demanded they die before speaking, what did survival mean now? In the quiet spaces of these camps, loyalty became a battlefield without clear victory. American personnel often carried their own grief. Friends lost, ambushes survived, memories of atrocities committed by Japanese forces in places like Bataan or Nanking. Hatred ran deep, yet official orders were clear. Follow international law. Uphold standards the enemy did not. Maintaining compassion in the face of bitter war required discipline. To treat a nurse who may have stood beside soldiers responsible for massacres, that was a moral challenge few had expected to face. But the Allies clung to the belief that cruelty must not be answered with cruelty. Soap became more than cleanliness. It was a declaration that their principles endured, even in the ashes of war. Kindness forced everyone involved to confront uncomfortable truths. Japanese women learned the enemy had a conscience. Allied soldiers learned humanity could survive rage. That fragile balance would be tested in the most intense moments of captivity, where fear, honor, and survival collided. And those moments shaped the climax of this story. By mid-1945, the Pacific War reached its most brutal phase. On islands like Okinawa, Japanese military resistance blended with civilian desperation. Underground hospitals, staffed by young women officers, became the final sanctuaries of a dying empire. The air reeked of infection and cordite. Lanterns flickered in the damp tunnels as artillery rumbled overhead. These women had treated shattered limbs, soothed dying soldiers, and lived in constant terror. They believed that if the enemy reached them, their final act must be to protect Japan's honor through death. But reality arrived differently. American troops forced open bunker entrances not with cruelty, but with caution. They weren't seeking vengeance. They were trying to end the bloodshed. Grenades were left unused. Weapons were discarded. Voices shouted in English, urging surrender, promising medical aid. Many Japanese women stared in disbelief, waiting for the brutality they had been taught to expect. When resistance ceased, U.S. medics moved quickly. Some women were too weak to stand. Others resisted treatment out of fear, covering their faces as bandages were changed. A nurse offered a small bar of soap to one officer, its clean scent foreign in a world of rot. The woman refused at first, shaking violently. But after a moment, exhausted, trembling, she allowed the nurse to help her wash the dirt and sweat from her hands. It was the first time in months she had felt something soft. On Luzon and in Manila, surrender brought similar encounters. Japanese women officers, still clinging to rigid posture and discipline, try to hide their fear behind formal bows. Their uniforms, once symbols of pride, were stained with dust and blood. American personnel instructed them to remove their gear, not as punishment, but to replace it with clean garments and ensure weapons were not concealed. Medical stations became surreal scenes. American doctors treating Japanese nurses, Allied women guiding them toward showers, guards offering blankets instead of threats. For the captives, panic warped into confusion. The emotional turning point often came not from food or shelter, but from water, warm or cold, it didn't matter. Standing in a line to wash under Allied supervision, women who had expected torment were instead given privacy. Towels were handed out carefully, as if dignity were something precious. Some cried silently. Others scrubbed their skin as if trying to erase the lies they had once believed. And in those moments, the foundations of their ideology began to collapse. The war, however, was not yet over. Many Japanese officers still clung to the idea that this treatment was a deception, that torture or humiliation would come later. Trust was fragile, built slowly through repeated acts of compassion. Then the world changed in two flashes of blinding light. Hiroshima on August 6th, Nagasaki on August 9th. News of the atomic bombings reached POWs through whispers from guards or broadcasts in languages they barely understood. They recognized the shock in Allied faces before anyone spoke the words. Japan had been forced to surrender. For women who had been willing to die for the emperor, the emotional fallout was overwhelming. The belief system that shaped their lives cracked completely. Survival was no longer shame, it was necessity. In the days following Japan's formal capitulation on September 2nd, 1945, a transformation swept through the camps. The women began to look up during meals. Their shoulders loosened. Some cautiously practiced English phrases of gratitude. Others shared their own food portions with Allied nurses to show respect. Bonded not by nationality, but by humanity, these small gestures marked the beginning of a profound shift. One where captives and captors realized the war between them had ended long before the peace treaty was signed. Yet, amid this fragile peace, a lingering question hung unspoken. When these women returned home, how would Japan receive them? That answer would bring its own kind of battlefield. As the Pacific War officially ended, the camps holding Japanese women officers became places of quiet adjustment. The sound of gunfire ceased. Air raids no longer shook the ground. What remained was the uncomfortable silence of survival, a silence filled with questions none of them had been prepared to face. The most difficult turning point did not come the moment the bombs fell or the emperor announced surrender. It came when the women realized they were no longer prisoners of war in the traditional sense. They were witnesses to a new world order. The uniforms they still wore, though worn and faded, no longer held power. The badges and ribbons signified a lost cause. And yet, the enemy continued to treat them with dignity. American nurses taught them how to disinfect wounds with new medical supplies. Showers became a regular routine rather than a rare privilege. Some camps allowed recreational exercise to help prisoners recover strength. Hair, once tangled and matted from cave air, was brushed and braided neatly again. A sense of normalcy, fragile but present, emerged. But normalcy can be frightening when everything you knew has collapsed. Some women officers struggled emotionally, feeling they had betrayed Japan simply by staying alive. In group discussions held by camp staff, they admitted guilt, fear, and profound confusion. Allied interpreters listened carefully. Psychological support, not yet a formal science, was quietly offered through patience rather than judgment. Still, the transformation was not universal. A handful refused every comfort. They sat rigidly on bedding, staring ahead with unbroken discipline. When given soap, they placed it beside them untouched, as if accepting it meant accepting defeat. For them, captivity was a prolonged death. Survival only extended the shame. But for many others, compassion had already begun to erode the barriers that propaganda had built. A moment that appeared small on the outside could become decisive internally. A nurse helping a Japanese officer wash blood from her hair. A guard offering an umbrella during rain. A medic bowing slightly before dressing a wound. A gesture that restored dignity. These gestures carried more weight than any military victory. One record described a group of women in Manila who received sanitary kits containing soap, cotton cloth, and laundry powder. After weeks of confusion, something shifted. They asked timidly for more cleaning supplies, a request that signaled a profound psychological change. They wanted to live well, not merely survive. The realization that their captors valued their well-being disrupted decades of national indoctrination. It urged them to reconsider everything they had been told about outsiders, war, and honor. And as they healed physically, a deeper, more personal healing began. Small friendships emerged, not loud or celebrated, but formed in quiet moments. An Allied nurse and a Japanese communications officer exchanging shy smiles. A shared laugh over a mispronounced English word. a folded towel handed back neatly, as if honoring the kindness attached to it. These were not alliances. These were acknowledgments of shared humanity. But the truest turning point came when the gates began to open. Repatriation orders spread through every camp. Ships were being prepared. Japan, battered, burned, and occupied, awaited those who had survived. Some women wept with relief. Others trembled at the thought of returning home in shame. Allied personnel noticed the conflicting emotions. Before departure, many provided prisoners with small parting gifts: combs, soap bars, fresh bandages, items symbolic of care. The Japanese women bowed deeply. Their eyes held gratitude impossible to speak aloud. For months, they had waited for cruelty. Instead, they encountered a powerful truth. The enemy had chosen humanity, and now they would carry that truth back to a homeland that did not yet know how to accept their survival. The women stepped on transport ships with mixed hearts, relief tied tightly to fear. What awaited them in Japan would not be a celebration of endurance, but a battle against silence, stigma, and the shadows of war. The turning point was complete. Bruised beliefs had shattered. New realities were waiting. But so were the consequences. Repatriation ships crossing the Pacific carried more than passengers. They carried the weight of an empire's collapse. Japanese women officers, once confident in their purpose, returned to a nation stripped of pride and cloaked in deep humiliation. Cities were rubble. Factories burned. Millions displaced. The emperor himself had spoken words many believed impossible. Japan had surrendered. For the women, the sight of home was not a warm welcome. It was a harsh reminder of everything they had lost. The moment they stepped ashore, relief collided with dread. Some searched for family members who might have survived the bombings. Others walked past neighbors who looked away in stiff silence. But the most difficult burden came from the cultural code they had lived under. Surrender equaled disgrace. Military authorities recorded their return, but provided little acknowledgement. Medals were not awarded for endurance. They were not called heroes. Instead, their survival became something to hide. Families asked questions quietly. Why didn't you die with honor? Why did you allow yourself to be captured? Why did you come back? There were no comforting answers. Some women attempted to resume ordinary roles, working as nurses, clerks, or caregivers in a devastated nation. But whispers followed them. They were viewed with confusion, even suspicion. Rumors questioned their purity. Propaganda from the war had left scars deeper than any battlefield wound. Many chose silence as their defense. They tucked away memories of clean towels and allied compassion, afraid they would be misunderstood. The soap that once represented rescue now reminded them of a shame society refused to release. Yet there was another reality, hidden beneath the weight of stigma. These women carried knowledge no textbook could provide. The enemy was not the monster they had been taught to fear. The lies that fueled their terror could no longer dominate their beliefs. And while they could not speak openly about their experiences, small shifts began to ripple through post-war Japan. In hospitals, working alongside occupation authorities, some women quietly advocated for improved hygiene practices and Western medical standards they had learned in captivity. In classrooms or local communities, a few encouraged more open views of the outside world. It was an invisible influence unfolding in subtle ways. The trauma of survival left long shadows, but so did the memory of unexpected kindness. The war had brought destruction, but captivity had brought an unlikely glimpse of humanity, a perspective that began shaping how Japan rebuilt its place in the world. Still, for every woman who found strength in survival, there were others who were never able to escape their psychological conflict. They lived caught between gratitude and guilt, progress and the past. The story did not end when they left the POW camps. It followed them into every room where silence felt safer than truth. Every memory of an Allied nurse helping them wash. Every night spent wondering whether living had been the right choice. The consequences of mercy echoed far beyond the war. For them to fully heal, Japan itself would need to change. Those changes, one quiet step at a time, would help shape the future of a nation that learned humanity could exist even in its darkest chapters. And this transformation sets the stage for the broader legacy these women carried, not as soldiers, not as symbols of defeat, but as survivors who witnessed a different side of war. For the Japanese women officers who returned home after years of captivity, liberation did not feel like victory. Their bodies were free, but the society they returned to did not want their stories. In post-war Japan, surrender remained a cultural wound. Many veterans, especially women, feared judgment more in peace than they ever had in war. They arrived in ports still scarred by firebombing. Cities stood silent under American occupation. Families waited, not in celebration, but in uncertainty. Survivors of POW camps were often greeted with a single question: "How did you live?" The implication was sharp. Endurance, once celebrated, now became suspicion. Some women hid their past entirely. They avoided reunions, avoided old comrades, avoided the gaze of neighbors who whispered that prisoners must have cooperated with the enemy. Their military records were intact. Their experiences were not. Silence became their shield. Yet the memories stayed sharp. Inside Allied camps, they had first encountered soap, clean bedsheets, vaccinations, and doctors who treated them as patients, not enemies. They had been allowed to write home. They had even received Red Cross parcels. But these truths contradicted the propaganda many Japanese civilians still clung to, the idea that Allied soldiers were monsters. Saying otherwise felt like committing a second betrayal. This cognitive dissonance followed them for decades. Some nurses and clerical officers later testified quietly to researchers and historians, not seeking credit, but clarity. They described the moment an Allied medic placed a towel into, their hands still warm from the sun. They remembered the confusion that turned into relief. Years later, the memory of soft cotton remained one of the strongest symbols of their captivity. Not barbed wire, not hunger, but dignity. As Japan rebuilt, women who had served in uniform found few places in a society rapidly returning to traditional roles. The wartime necessity that once opened doors, training, rank, responsibility, was now dismissed as an unspoken past. Some married and never mentioned the war again. Others kept small diaries tucked away in drawers, written for a future where someone might finally ask and listen. Internationally, their imprisonment took on a different meaning. Allied reports detailing humane treatment of female Japanese POWs became a part of post-war policy discussions, evidence that even amid brutal campaigns in the Pacific, the Geneva Convention could still influence behavior. These accounts stood in stark contrast to Japanese-run camps where Allied women suffered malnutrition, forced labor, and high mortality. This difference deepened the moral divide exposed by the war. Two nations locked in total conflict, yet guided by profoundly different codes toward their enemies. Over time, wounds began to open into understanding. By the late 20th century, researchers posted interviews and documents that recorded the shock and disbelief of the Japanese women when they first received hygiene items, soap, towels, sanitary supplies, offered without conditions. What struck historians was not just the material relief, but the emotional impact. Their captors recognized them as human beings with needs. This small humanity, shown in the darkest chapter of the Pacific War, survived the decades better than flags, medals, or commands. Today, a few remaining testimonies remind us of how close fear and dignity can sit together. A war defined by brutality also carried moments that gently refused to surrender to hatred. For these women, captivity revealed something they had never been allowed to imagine, that an enemy could protect life rather than destroy it. And that realization would shape how they remembered everything that came before. The story of their return, shadowed by silence, yet illuminated by fragments of compassion, leads to one final truth about war, survival, and the fragile presence of humanity in the harshest places. Because in the end, those simple objects placed in their hands would become symbols far larger than soap and towels, symbols of a world trying, even in conflict, to hold on to its conscience. And that is where reflection must begin. War often leaves behind loud stories, battles, treaties, victories carved into stone. But sometimes the quietest moments reveal the most about who we are. For the Japanese women captured in the final years of the Pacific War, a single moment stays recorded in history. The shock of being handed soap and towels by the very enemy they had been taught to fear. It was not grand strategy. It was not a turning point of military strength. It was a gesture so small that, on a battlefield, it would have been invisible. Yet it changed everything. These women had entered the war under a doctrine that placed honor above life. Surrender was shame. Mercy was weakness. The enemy was a threat beyond imagination. But captivity proved that the war they were shown was not the war they lived. They discovered that the side with greater firepower also had rules. Rules protecting prisoners, rules recognizing the dignity of the captured, rules that refused to mirror the cruelty seen elsewhere in the Pacific. That contradiction became a quiet legacy. Their shock was not just cultural. It revealed the distance between propaganda and truth, between what a nation tells its people and what humanity can still choose to be. In the ruins of the Second World War, this difference mattered. It pointed to a future where conflict might be fought without abandoning conscience entirely. The women returned home, carrying a truth many were afraid to speak aloud, that even in war, compassion survives. Every towel, every bar of soap, every gesture of respect said something powerful, that an enemy does not have to become a monster, that survival can include dignity, that the rules of war, when followed, can protect more than bodies. They can protect what it means to be human. History remembers the tragedies of the Pacific War in painful detail. But hidden within those shadows is a reminder that humanity is never fully lost. Sometimes it is found in the simplest things, passed from one hand to another, quietly refusing to give up.